Thank you, Barry. Good morning, everybody. I hope you're not as tired as I am, but yesterday was fantastic, and I want to thank all the speakers again and all the audience participants. One of the things I think that was so wonderful was the energy between the speakers and the audience. The questions were fantastic, so keep that coming. So it's my great privilege to introduce Dr. Michael Thaut. I think many of you may know him. He is the chair of the Department of Music and the scientific director of Colorado State Center for Biomedical Research in Music. He's been the director of the School of Arts at Colorado State from 2001 and 2010. And for the last 2 years, he's been in Germany coordinating a university system there. Michael's still the president of the International Society of Clinical Neuromusicology and of the World Federation of Neurorehabilitation. And I suppose among the seminal work he's done in this field, he's best known for the early intervention of music therapy in Parkinson's disease and the discovery of the connection of music and the motor function and improvement in motor function there. And I'm sure he's going to talk to us about that and everything. Michael, thank you so much for coming and participating in the conference.
Good morning. Good morning. Good morning. Good. It's a great pleasure to be here. As Cheryl said, we came back from Germany 3 weeks ago, and so I slept in my own bed for a few days, my own old bed, and then we went to San Diego trying to have a vacation, which turned out to be a little bit different, and then now I'm here, and this morning I woke up and I didn't know for a moment in which bed I was actually sleeping. That can lead to problems, especially when you think you know where the bathroom is. Well, you only think. Anyway, I walked around Santa Fe for a little bit this morning. It's a beautiful city. I've been here many times, more from an artistic point of view. And I think I have firmly reestablished myself where I am, at least for the next hour. It's a great pleasure and honor to be here. It's been a wonderful experience so far, and I want to thank the organizers, the University of New Mexico, the Chamber Music Festival. It's really very interesting because this symposium is revisiting a long, ancient tradition of considering music as a science. Way through the Baroque period, the understanding that music was as much a science as a performing art was well established. During the probably Romantic period, we lost most of that understanding, but it's wonderful to see this being revisited. So really for the known history of music of the last, 2,000-something years, music, most of the time, was also considered a science. So Bach, for instance, was a member of a musical society, science society. Telemann was. Bach took great pride to be called a learned cantor or Kapellmeister. It was part of his title, der Gelehrte Kapellmeister Bach. And Leibniz called music actually the subconscious arithmetics of the mind. So Kepler, you may know that, his famous book Harmonis, De Harmonis Mundi, was inspired, the title was inspired by when he discovered that the elliptical planetary motion followed exactly in the ratio that was in the overtone series. Mars traveled in a 4-to-5 ratio elliptically and so forth. So he thought that God had created the universe actually as a sounding body. If you could just put resonators on there in the sky, then we would have an eternal concert playing in the universe, created by the universe. So some of these nice examples of this kind of concept. And we are revisiting this concept now in the last 20 years, and it's a wonderful moment to do this here also in connection with a very vibrant music event that I greatly admire and have been here before. So today my talk will be on music, motor control, and therapy. And so before I go into some of the more technical detail, I want to give sort of a bigger clinical picture where this all has led. We started doing this research about 20 years ago, 20 plus years ago, I have to say, and published our first papers on some of the observations. And we were inspired, I was inspired really, by sort of an intuition that a lot of the motor learning that's quite sophisticated and quite dramatic in music is driven by some structural perceptual elements in the music itself. And my personal bias was always, it has to do something with timing, because when the timing in your practice goes off, then you can never put a piece together. And we still see that in the practice rooms of music conservatories on a daily basis. I walked through this for years as a dean, and all the easy passages are being played fast, and all the difficult passages are played slow. And so you have these wonderful tempo fluctuations throughout your building, vibrating in multiple frequencies, and of course that leads to problems. Anyway, we tried to apply this high-performance model to turn around and said, how about if this is the driver for learning, for high-performance learning, can this be also the driver for high-performance relearning, retraining, re-education? And we know from much research in neurological rehabilitation that learning and relearning, training and retraining the brain, re-educating and educating the brain follow the same principles of learning, plasticity, etc. So today, I'm not trying to establish that music and rhythm, especially as one of the main components, is successful in helping motor recovery in stroke, Parkinson, and other movement disorders. I think that's been well established over the last 20 years by our research, but also by many other laboratories that have now replicated this. Today, I think I like to, at least that's how I understood the charge, like to talk about some of the how, but still at the end show videos that illustrate how this all works, so that we hopefully get a pretty complete picture. The big clinical picture I want to give you first is that this research was one of the first areas in motor control, and then it has been supplemented by speech and language research and has been supplemented by cognitive research, especially in the last 10, 12 years, to build a evidence-based, standardized model of music therapy practice, which we have called neurologic music therapy, and that has been very successful as a clinical method. And it's endorsed by the World Federation of Neurorehabilitation, practiced by over 1,000 certified people in the world. And just to give you a little quick picture up here, so today we're talking about these techniques and how they came about in sensorimotor rehabilitation. Now, if I give you a little mnemonic device like a jingle, you could probably remember all these acronyms in 30 seconds or less. But the jingle has to be familiar to you, of course. Actually, we taught our kids our telephone numbers when they were 3 years old or so, with a little song, and they still sing that thing, and I sing it too now. Since I'm getting older, so the life cycle, you know, you get teeth, you lose teeth, you remember things, you forget things, and so forth. Anyway, concept of rhythm. Rhythm is a complicated thing, and I think some of the speakers yesterday have already alluded to this. What seems easy is actually not that easy. First of all, rhythm is more than just metrical rhythm. There are lots of rhythms, okay? And also, even in music, we have rhythms that are not styles, genres, melismatic singing, etc., that are not metric. Okay, so we're talking about, in general, temporal structure of events. Is that my phone? No. Now, we will translate this then more into the metrical concept after that. But rhythm, number two, is also a hierarchical structure. Rhythm is a composite term. So when somebody says, I study rhythm, I think we need to ask, what in rhythm? Beats, pulses, meters, patterns, the macrostructure of tempo, etc., etc. So rhythm is a layered composite. And we also know now that some of the networks that support these components in rhythm are partially segregated, okay? Which is interesting. This may actually be one of the neurobiological foundations for the very differential rhythmic architecture in the music in the world. There are musical traditions, musical styles that have no meters, okay, or very different concepts of meter. The medieval and Renaissance rhythmic modes of Western music compared to what came starting in the 17th century are very different and very much more complicated. Number three, we have to have a sense in metric rhythms of pulse, salience underneath all of it. However, the interesting thing is, and I come to that in a lot of detail in a couple of minutes, pulses are not what determines, at least in my understanding, rhythm. Rhythm is an interval phenomenon. Pulses are markers. Pulses are markers. Rhythms are interval events. And so that is a very, I think, important concept of understanding. If I ask you to clap with me, then you can obviously do this perfectly. I stop clap and you continue to clap, although there is no pulse present to cue you, because you have created an interval percept in your brain on which you map your motions. Also, you may say, and it's a little fastidious, maybe I shouldn't say that. A lot of orchestra musicians don't look at the conductors because it gets them confused. They have internal templates. So rhythm is really an interval template. That's important. And lastly, all rhythmic performance is essentially a synchronization performance layered onto templates over other templates, et cetera, in a vertical layer. So those are some of the remarks that may be important to follow, and there's much interesting, very important for therapy, as there are also interesting just for understanding from a musicological point of view, what is rhythm. Talking about synchronization, which is a very important concept in interventions, the interesting thing is, Dr. Patel alluded to this, showed it actually yesterday. One of the interesting things is when we tap to a rhythmic beat, we tap ahead of the beat in the auditory modality. So we tap to something we haven't heard yet. That's relatively easy to explain because we are basing an interval estimate based on pulses and intervals we've heard before. So as soon as we finish our tap, we hear the click. That gives us perfect feedback. How close, how far away are we? Did we match the proper distance? And that gives us also a nice feed-forward model to then plan the next tap. So the interesting thing is when you interrupt that, let's say here, I think I can get this with the mouse going, oops, no, here. So now, since people anticipate the pulses, now we are extending the interval, so we're actually slowing down the tempo. People are tapping based on the previous model in the middle of nowhere, right? Now they're off. Okay, now they have a choice. They can make if you look at the primary SE adaptation there at the bottom, they can make a long period error, so to mess up the interval to catch up with the beat. Or if you look at primary IRI adaptation, they can actually say, I want to immediately follow the new period, and I care less if I'm really totally on the beat. I can whittle that down later. Our expectation, as I think probably most researchers at that time, thought that, of course, people will compromise the interval and try to catch up with the beat. That actually turned out to be wrong. In small fluctuations of tempo, under about 5% of the interval magnitude, which is sort of just about where people, the subconscious threshold, so to speak. People don't realize that anything changes anyway. They will actually prioritize the new period and not worry that they're now a little with their tap a little further away from the actual pulse cue. So primary adaptation is in synchronization strategy to actually match the interval. And we can slack around the beat. Only if the error gets so large, people uncouple and say, I got to make a big, big period error 2 or 3 times, and I catch up and then lock again. Now that sounds a little theoretical, but here you can actually see the strategies. The red is the immediate adaptation to the new period, and then the error, the synchronization error on the bottom, the red one, is then slowly whittled down. The other option would be to make a big error, conscious error, to catch up with the beat. That people only do when the tempo change is too large. So that leads to a very important observation and explanation, because in our early studies, we found that people, when they start walking or moving to an auditory rhythmic stimulus, they did not just adapt to stepping or moving the hand on the pulse and continuing relatively poor movement of a paretic leg or a paretic arm. They changed the whole pattern of movement. As one of my colleagues said, Michael, you're studying stroke patients who limp, and now you give a metronome and they limp to the metronome. What's the big deal? Well, we saw that they've stopped limping, and I'll show you videos. The reason being, one of the reasons being, is that if you look at the green lines, rhythm provides an interval timer, which is a continuous time reference at any moment of a movement. The change in the movement happens between the beats and not on the beat. Think of it this way, because that changes how the brain now plans and maps movement onto a time template. A pilot sits on an airplane in Denver, let's say, and the order is you have to fly in 120 minutes from here to Chicago. So that is the template. And this is the parameter set up for the pilot to do now what? To calculate the necessary velocity and to calculate the necessary flight path to get there in a given velocity, and then calculate the accelerations and also the force thrust for the engines, etc. That is exactly how rhythm works in a little bit of a simplified model. The rhythmic template gives the brain all the necessary parameters to recalculate my movement. I have to be from here to here in 500 milliseconds. That determines my acceleration angle, my velocity, my deceleration, and it also determines what path my arm needs to take to get there in time. Okay? And, of course, then also it determines the application of muscle. So a very important finding from rhythmic synchronization and entrainment. We are not just coordinating and reorganizing time. By reorganizing time, we are actually also reorganizing all the derivative parameters of position in space and force. And you can actually show that nicely mathematically. It took us several years to figure that out. And I still get exhausted when I talk about it. And so the end effect, and this is actually a very complicated mathematical thing here, but it looks like a little roulette thing. These are relaxation lines of changes in tempo and how that green line, which is the motor response, is driven, inevitably driven into the center of the match. And that's what's called entrainment. In other words, a system with a given frequency locks another system into its frequency and drives it. And that's the exact process we're seeing as the basis for music in motor control. And the auditory system is so subtle and so fast that in minute changes that are below the complete level of conscious threshold, the motor system will still receive that information and begin to swing, so to speak, with the auditory rhythmic changes. And this is a little graph that shows that in cross-correlation form. So you see the solid lines is the rhythmic cue, and then the dotted line is the rhythmic response, and the top rectangle there is the change, is 1% of the interval. So at 500 milliseconds, 1% would be 5 milliseconds. So the metronome here swings from 500 to 495 to 500 to 505 and back. And you can see already how the hand begins to follow that, although the subject has absolutely no idea that there is any change in fluctuation in the tempo. At 3%, you can see it very clearly, and so forth, and so forth. So those are foundational functions for the effect of rhythm and sound on the motor system. And we can do this in syncopation. People tap an outer phase. So in mid-trajectory of the arm moving from point to point, up here, the beat occurs right here, right? Because we are now syncopating, and then land here. And we're changing this a little bit, and then the hand has only half cycle left, maybe 150, 200 milliseconds, to speed up or slow down to match interval against interval. And we have studied this very interestingly with the cerebellar patients, because there was a notion that the cerebellum is the big timekeeper in the brain. Well, it's not, at least not chronometrically, because once you take the noise out of the motor drive, they do it as well with these kind of changes and adaptations as healthy subjects. So the motor system is extremely sensitive to receiving that information from the auditory system. Thanks. Now, where are these interactions taking place in the brain? Well, they take place on multiple levels. Already in the brainstem, auditory system here, at the first cell nucleus, auditory information is connected into the reticular formation, which synapses to the motor and interneurons on the spinal cord, superior olive, et cetera, et cetera. All these areas, all the way up to the basal ganglia and the auditory cortex, have pathway connections between auditory neurons and motor neurons. So now, with the previous information, you can probably create a relatively simple model in your mind, which is enough to understand, and also it is correct in the most basic schematic sense, that if we feed rhythm into the brain, the vibration patterns of, let's say, a metronome or a percussion instrument, whatever, these vibration patterns are turned into electrochemical pulse firing rates. Takes place in the cochlea, that transmission in the organ of Corti. And so the neurons in these, between these along the pathway, the neurons begin to fire in rhythmic synchrony with the external stimulus source. And since the rhythms that we're looking at are relatively slow, only like 2 hertz or something, the brain says, that's ridiculous, I can speed up and I can actually figure this out all the way to 16,000 hertz. Don't worry. So think about it. So the auditory neurons fire at, let's say, a rate of 2 hertz. That would be 2 movements a second. And the auditory neuron synapses with the motor neuron, and that firing rate is in complete resonance transmitted into the motor neuron that now also begins to fire in the same connection. And when we do this repetitively, then we can turn this entrainment and synchronization effect into actually retraining the neural motor networks in new organized time fashion. I'll show you this in a little bit of a schematic way. These are overlaying firing patterns here. Let's say this is the auditory beat. Then we have neurons, auditory and motor neurons, fire being activated in resonance, and the behavioral result is actually I showed here. I have to say that, of course, we did not record from this patient the data up there, but this is for illustration purposes. It's a Parkinson patient who, as soon as the metronome kicks in, his motor system becomes locked into the stimulus. Okay, and here are some other, I'll go through this rather quickly, areas where we have known auditory motor connections in the inferior colliculus in the brainstem. We have a wonderful loops in the basal ganglia and cortex between the striatum and the inferior frontal gyrus, which is very important in rhythmic processing. We have a big fiber bundle in the cortex, the acute fasciculus between the temporal lobe and frontal areas, motor areas, and prefrontal, more cognitive-oriented areas and speech areas. And we can actually even look at how in the prefrontal cortex these rhythmic motor networks break out depending on the size of the tempo change. We have small tempo changes are reflected in relatively small medial changes in the prefrontal cortex, and then as they get better, it becomes ventral and then dorsolateral because the tracking strategy changes with that. And we see that also reflected in differential cerebellar activations between anterior and posterior lobes. And we can actually see nicely how cerebellar on the left and cortical circuits have similar activations. The bars from left to right always go control condition, random rhythm, isochronous steady rhythm, 3% interruption, 7% fluctuation, 20% fluctuation, and the random and the 20% have the same magnitude of change. So you can see how they relate to each other on top. Motor circuitry in the middle, the panels, the circuit reflects the exact temporal modulation, and on the bottom, only the 20% where people really need to follow a pattern that changes in very large measure begins to be activated. We'll skip that and just maybe go into a little summary here. Neural networks for rhythm components are partially segregated. Rhythm is a composite term. I'll show that in a minute. And rhythm processing involves a network of temporal, prefrontal, motor, and inferior parietal, but very important, linked with a lot of subcortical transmission stations already. As once this thing ends up in the cortical processing systems, it has already been transmitted, as I showed in this auditory pathway graph, into multiple areas that are responsible for motor control. So the good news about all this is it is a distributed, very stable system that helps us to access the motor system of a patient and help them to create a harness or scaffold to retrain their motor system and drive it with helpful sensor input into the right functions. Here we see how differential rhythmic patterns are processed, rhythmic pattern processing, tempo processing, meter processing, duration processing, all different networks. So, but this would be a topic for another presentation because that could go deep into neuromusicology. Okay, pass to the clinic. This research has been going on for 20 years, and we have really made, I think, a real impact, not just in terms of establishing these techniques in neurologic music therapy, but also in ways that are translated into neurorehab in general. Techniques that we've developed here are taught in physical therapy schools in this country and internationally. And so this is a fascinating turn of the high-performance model into a retraining and re-education model for the brain. I want to show some examples. First, I show one of the very first patients we ever recorded. It was a cerebellar patient, and you can see everything I just talked in theory now live for the next 10 minutes. So here's an ataxic gait pattern. Several of you have probably seen this already. You see the sequencing, the balance issues. This gentleman has a cerebellar focal disorder. Very unstable gait too, which is another additional problem. Falling is a huge issue in movement disorders.
You know what it was right No cheating on the bar.
And we're matching
Okay. Stop.
the metronome cue to his internal step frequency. And now you can see everything I just talked in theory in practice. There's an immediate change. The guy is not just stumbling now to the beat. He is actually not stumbling. His recalculation of his movement control parameters in the brain has substantially changed just by the addition of a metronome cue. This stroke patient, also very old, just to show you the tradition of and the density of the research. This is also from one of our first stroke studies, 1997. It's in right parietal stroke. You can see all kinds of issues with the paretic side that really compromise the kinematics of walking completely. And the immediate entrainment effect you can see here now. Everything is recalculated and remapped and scaled due to the rhythmic constraint. You can see it from the side. And even when he gets stuck with a little hyperextension, reset and go. And here is the continuous training effect without RES, of course, after 6 weeks. So we have done several studies comparing this also with other physical therapy gait techniques, and RES usually comes out on top. The magic of the music has been well established. And here are some of the kinematic measures that show how think about the idea what I just gave with the pilot, okay? The control tower says you got to be there in 90 minutes. The pilot has to rethink, what's the path? Can I fly over South Dakota or can I fly over Tennessee? No, I have to take a straight path because I can only go 600 miles an hour. So all this is translate that into my step now, take off, I know when I have to land, and at any given moment of the movement cycle, I know how much time has elapsed and how much time is still left to program the movement onto that template, okay? And that changes, for instance, how the person sways vertical in the horizontal plane, okay? Or how the muscle drive is activated much less variable. The bottom shows the gastrocnemius muscle deviations. The top shows without cueing. Parkinson. We have published several Parkinson papers on that, and many others have done that too now. This technique is, I think, in all the major textbooks on gait rehab. This is actually a long-term follow-up study, 53 meters per minute walking at pre-test, 65 at post-test, and then weekly post-testing without further training. And in a degenerative disorder for about 4 weeks, this will last, and then the internal oscillators have to be probably reset. Here are data from Germany. Classic also the stopping, the momentary freezing when the environmental conditions change. And no problem with the sensory cue. The oscillatory locking between the motor and the auditory system is established, and the sensory system, the auditory system, drives the motor system. Pretty pragmatic festination example here. Here's an example of a daily application. When I show that, usually there gets a lot of commentary among Parkinson's support groups because that's what they know so well. And this is how this can be a very practical help. Okay, let's talk about briefly the rest of the movement situation, not just walking, because now outside of gait we don't have natural oscillatory, biologically oscillatory movements, maybe hand riding to a certain extent. The arm swing is mechanically locked into the gait movement. So what do we do when we want to work on arm, for instance, which is very important? We have to turn discrete movements, like a reaching movement, into a continuous cyclical movement. And then, so we create a pattern. a movement pattern. That could be a simple flexion extension, that could be a reaching, grasping, lifting, whatever. And we translate those kinematic parameters into sound parameters. That could be a simple 2-4 or 4-4 meter, that could be more complicated. Now we have a cyclical movement pattern that we can train repetitively as a rhythmic sequence. Here you see basically a bit of a setup there. Sometimes we use touch tablets where we can give patients very clear directions of what kind of movements, adduction, abduction, etc. It's very helpful. You can see that baseline, this person is moving the arm, the hand, from the tabletop to the back target to a mounted target and back. And this is the trajectory of the hand. And you see how completely erratic that is. There are moments in the movement where the movement doesn't even take off. The person slides. Okay, practice without music. Okay, it gets a little better. And now practice with rhythm. The parameters change as soon as you feed that template into the brain and everything is recalculated. Think of the pilot in that airplane before the pilot takes off, hopefully. We see this on the velocity profiles that become smoothened out, and we see it in the acceleration profiles that become smoothened out. And the interesting thing is when you change something from a discrete movement to a cyclical movement, you also force a different path of movement. So the patients here in the cyclical movement with the paretic arm, they use, I can show that here, they use a lot of trunk flexion to compensate for the lack of extension they have in the paretic arm. So they're compensated with flexion and very little blue rotation, okay? Now, we do here the trunk rotation becomes much more pronounced when we do it in the discrete, in the cyclical training. So turning discrete, independent, short movement segments into connected, cyclical, rhythmically cued movements helps to change the path entirely. I'm done. Okay, I want to leave this with an impression of how that can be translated also into a technique that we call TIMP, where we use musical instruments in exact spatial positions, and then we create rhythmic environments for the kids to work on functional movements. And everything we just reviewed or spoke about in theory, about rhythm, music, auditory, and motor system, you can see in that little excerpt, translated into a clinical technique that's been also specifically researched and been very successful. Thank you very much.
So we are already running late this morning, which I promised we wouldn't do, but we'll end on time because we must. But as we have Dr. Schlag come forward and get ready, a couple questions for Dr. Thaut. Anybody? Yes, please.
Did the subjects in your walking studies, were they asked to walk in rhythm to the music or not? Were they asked to walk to the music?
We ask them to walk in rhythm, yeah. Yeah.
So Michael, when a person who doesn't have a neurologic deficit walks, We talked yesterday about how composers compose without hearing music, so they don't need an auditory cue. Somehow, because of their prior experiences, they can organize the brain in a way to hear the music and, as Mark talked about yesterday, lay on the floor and lay out his music. So is that how all of us walk? And then as we learn as children to create sort of an internal rhythm that cues the motor system to have a normal gait pattern, and then when you have a stroke or Parkinson's disease, that auditory signal becomes a reorganizing principle? Is that
Yeah.
sort of what you envision then?
I think that's in principle correct. I think the gait is, as I said, that's the only biologically wired rhythmic movement. And the other movements have to be turned into cyclical patterns. That is not natural. And what we're doing with the sensory template, with the musical template, we're basically putting a time code as an enhancer into the motor system to recalculate those parameters. And if you do this continuously and repetitively, then it becomes actually also a training and learning stimulus that addresses plasticity. So it goes beyond the immediate short-term entrainment.
So if you look at infants learning to walk, are they actually creating an internal clock that organizes that
The
motor
internal
movement?
clock is already wired into the brainstem and spinal cord. That's already there. It just needs to mature. Yeah.
Two questions. I noticed in your studies you had 3 and 6 weeks. What is the optimum time for retraining?
You can see that after 3 weeks there was a significant improvement, or after 6 weeks there were even more. We don't have a lot of good dosage studies in neuro rehab. They become probably more and more important because insurances want to know, do we need to pay for another 3 weeks or what? So I think you have to have you can see from the achievement, the functional achievement, when a person gets up to a functional gait stride cadence and a velocity in 2 weeks and they walk at 100 meters per minute, that's probably okay. But the goal is not so much how long, rather than in order to be functional, mobile, you probably need to walk at a certain velocity, otherwise you don't go anywhere.
My other question is, if there's a disruption between the left and right hemispheres, do you have to address that before you can start the retrain?
There's no difference between left and hemispheric strokes. There may be some difference in, deeper laying and brainstem strokes, basal ganglia strokes, stuff like that. But in general, the left hemisphere, right hemisphere makes no difference. And sound, interestingly, is distributed actually ipsilaterally in the brain. So there is actually not just the contralateral, but also the ipsilateral pathway available.
Okay, thank you.
Just a quick one. Has this ever been tried with the subthalamic deep brain stimulation? Has this NMT ever been used with people that have had that procedure done?
Not in a systematic.
Okay. And then the entrainment, before you can entrain, you have to establish a baseline. Yeah. Is there, how do you do that sometimes when there's...
The best clinical estimator for a physical therapist or neurologic music therapist who can't go through the math and kinematic calculation is look at what they walk in a minute, how many steps.
And then you can adjust
that is as close to the internal optimal gait cadence at that moment as it gets.
Yeah.
That gives you a good starting point as a clinician.
Good, thanks.
So, Michael, as you're walking away from the stage, in 6 weeks, the video you showed of the man who could walk, the stroke patient, quite normally, he in that limited time has already done enough reprogramming through plasticity, I presume, that he's created his internal clock, basically.
Yeah, I think we need to look at patients, the gold standard for patient maintenance of success of therapy is continuous training. We know in neuro rehab the only thing that works because of the plasticity issue are learning and training paradigms. The passive stimulation, moving people around mats, balls, all kinds of stuff, doesn't work. So this patient will function essentially like I do as a violinist or you as an organist. If we don't keep it up, he will lose it.
I was hoping to ask something along the lines that you just answered. So this individual patient 6 weeks later, can that person consciously remember to repeat a beat in his head and walk properly? Or if he were out on the street by himself, would he lose the proper gait?
I think as long as he keeps training, he'll maintain it in stroke. Parkinson's is a little different story because they have that some of their time estimation in their brain kind of deteriorates more easily. So we had an interesting anecdote. A patient walks there now. They walked with Walkman there in the 90s. Everyone in Fort Collins walked around in the parks with Walkman. And so the guy, his battery runs out, and he panics, of course. And so he sings himself home. So to a certain extent, auditory imagery, as Dr. Sartori mentioned, auditory imagery, auditory thinking ability, which we all have, can, to a certain extent, replace that.
So, Michael, thank you so much.
Okay.